This is lesson 5, and in this lesson we're going to be studying how Dickens begins to present supernatural events in stave 1. So in this stave, again, we're going to come across a number of words that might not make sense to a 21st century reader. So we've got the word melancholy, which is a feeling of sadness with no obvious cause. Beguiled, help time pass pleasantly. Dreary, depressing, dull or bleak. Bestowed, to put something in its place. Impenetrable, impossible to pass through or enter. Phenomenon, a remarkable thing or event. Relinquished, to voluntarily give up. Irresolution, to be hesitant or uncertain. Peal, loud ringing of bells. Vaguely, a way which is uncertain. Custom, a traditional or accepted way of doing things. And brood, to think deeply about something that makes you unhappy. So in this stave, it mentions a number of different places and objects which might not be as familiar to a 21st century reader. It mentions a tavern, which is a pub. It mentions a door knocker, which not all doors now have. It mentions a pigtail, which we might think of as something that a young girl would wear, but actually a pigtail is at the back of a man's hairstyle or wig. It mentions a wine merchant's cellar. It mentions a Victorian coach, which is a type of sort of horse and trap. It mentions a locomotive hearse, which carried the bodies of the dead during the Victorian era. It also mentions some scriptures which are illustrated on a fireplace. These are sacred writings of Christianity in the Bible. And finally, it also mentions about a house bell. Victorian houses would actually have bells for every room so that servants could be called during the 19th century. So let's move on to reading the next section of the text. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile of building up a yard where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide and seek with other houses and forgotten the way out again. It was old enough now and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Also that Scrooge had a little of what is called fancy about him, as any man in the city of London, even including, which is a bold word, the corporation, alderman and livery. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intimate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. So looking at this extract in a little bit more detail, we've got the repetition of the word melancholy at the start, which is used to show how sad and lonely Scrooge is. We learn in this paragraph that this house once belonged to his dead friend Marley. Dickens personifies Scrooge's home by comparing it to a lost child playing at hide and seek. Perhaps this is to show how Scrooge is secluded and hidden from normal society. We learn that Scrooge is getting money from renting his rooms out, not letting it out to poor families, but to offices, which shows how Scrooge wanted to make money from the middle classes. Genius of the weather refers to the Roman beliefs that gods were supernatural representations of places of nature. The next section mentions the very large door knocker, which perhaps represents Marley wanting to demonstrate his wealth and status to anyone who once visited him. Dickens is keen to emphasise just how normal this door knocker is and how Scrooge had little fancy about him, which suggests that he was acting in a normal manner. Marley's face. It was not in impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That and its livid colour made it horrible, but its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control, rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause, with a moment's irresolution, before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door, except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on, so he said, "Pooh-pooh," and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellar below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. Looking at that extract again in a bit more detail. When seeing the knocker, Scrooge is described as having a terrible sensation to which his blood had been a stranger since infancy. This feeling is fear, because the face in the knocker has scared him. He hasn't experienced this since being a child, which makes us wonder what made him that way. The fact that he has realised he can still feel this emotion after all these years has also shocked him, as he is new to feeling it. Later it shows how he is in disbelief and almost mocking himself for his reaction. The sound resounding through the house shows how large the house was, yet again emphasising his wealth. You may talk vaguely about driving a coach and six up a good old flight of stairs or through a bad young Act of Parliament, but I mean to say you might have got a hearse up that staircase and taken it broadwise, with the splinter bar towards the wall and the door towards the balustrades, and done it easily. There was plenty of width for that, and room to spare, which is perhaps the reason why Scrooge thought he saw a locomotive hearse going on before him in the gloom. Half a dozen gas lamps out of the street wouldn't have lighted the entry too well, so you may suppose that it was pretty dark with Scrooge's dip. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel, Scrooge had a cold in his head, upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual, old fireguard, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in, double-locked himself in, which was not his usual custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers, and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. So in this section, Dickens describes Scrooge's house as being so large that you can easily fit a hearse coffin up the stairs sideways. This also emphasises the social injustice, which is one of the key themes, which shows the contrast between the wealthy and the poor. The rich have so much money that they don't even know what to do with it. The hearse going up the stairs is potentially carrying Marley's dead body, ready for him to arrive as a ghost later in the stave. Where it says darkness is cheap, this could reflect Scrooge's cold and miserly personality. It could also imply that Scrooge enjoys being alone, without happiness, this being suggested by the lack of light. Later it shows that he doesn't feed himself sufficiently by only eating a small bowl of gruel, Also, he uses very little coal. Even at that time, coal was quite cheap. It shows that he likes to be efficient in life by not wasting time preparing food and by not spending any more money than he needs to. Despite his steely outer shell, we see Scrooge is scared. The reader can relate to this fear, which shows that he's human. This helps us to believe that Scrooge is capable of change later on. It also mentions a cravat, which is a type of scarf, and a nightcap, which would be a hat that was traditionally worn to bed. It was a very low fire indeed. Nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all round with quaint Dutch tiles, designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cains and Abels, Pharaoh's daughters, Queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descending through the air on cloud-like feather beds, Abrahams, Belshazzars, apostles putting off to sea in butter boats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts, and yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like the ancient prophet's rod and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been a blank first, with power to shape some picture on its surface from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of old Marley's head on every one. "Humbug!" said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns, he sat down again. As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room and communicated, for some purpose now forgotten, with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute, or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the cask in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. So in this section, even Scrooge is feeling cold by brooding over the fire. He wants to feel the warmth, which is a complete contrast to how he was described as being cold at the beginning. This perhaps symbolises how he's ready for a change, or is ready to become more warm and generous. The use of the religious symbolism on the fireplace is in direct contrast with everything we've seen of Scrooge so far, namely his lack of Christian values. The idea that pictures such as these on the fireplace are in Scrooge's home foreshadows the future themes, such as the idea that while Scrooge was outwardly mean, the Christmas spirit was in him or in his house all along. The toll of the bells later on could suggest that it's time for your death or the arrival of the dead, or the arrival of old Marley as a ghost. He is so scared he loses track of time when it says this might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seems like an hour. And then finally we have Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. This phrase holds heavy Christian symbolism, as Scrooge is chained to his way of life. The chains represent how heavy Marley's sins were. They are a burden that he must carry. This could also possibly symbolise that as Marley is currently in purgatory, the chains, his sins, are dragging him down towards hell.